If I've got a time machine and I could say to you, Libby, you can't go to the future, but you can go anytime in America's past. You pick the nice, calm Goldilocks zone where it's going to be great. Everybody's getting along. Where are you going?
Oh gosh, if I could pick one time, I actually would love to go to the one of Dolley Madison's squeezes. That's what I would love to go back to War of 1812 and be at one of Dolley Madison's um, parties. I think that would be really awesome just to see all those political figures in one room, all interacting with each other, and to actually meet Dolley, I think would be really awesome. That would be very fun. I'll have to try to think about that tonight when I fall asleep, so that maybe I have a dream that I'm at a one of Dolley's squeezes. But it would be neat though to see Richmond during the Civil War. I mean, the suffering in Richmond was amazing because the population exploded, like quadruple, because all of a sudden it was a capital, it was the capital city of the Confederacy. And then so many of the battles were fought right around Richmond that all the prisoners of war were brought there. And then all the wounded on both sides were brought there. Basically, like everybody's house in Richmond turned into like a hospital caring for an injured soldier. And, the inflation was like 700%. And I mean, there was a blockade all the way down the East Coast, and it went all the way up the Mississippi around the South. So, I mean, people were starving, and in Richmond in particular, and housing was so short and the Confederacy didn't have any money or time to make any more buildings, to build anything. They were trying to, build things for the military. So people couldn't even find anywhere to rent. It got to the point where you could rent like the floor in their parlor from like 8 o'clock at night till 6 in the morning. And that was, and then it was incredibly expensive because the housing was so limited and for the amount of people that were flooding in. And then there were a lot of people who were flooding in because they felt safer there, that they were better protected than, there were people who had like both armies trudging across their fields having battles. I mean, it literally happened. So there were, people flooding in from all over the place for a multitude of different reasons. And some people were even bringing in there, and they were bringing their slaves in there to kind of keep the slaves, in check, so that one of the Union Army wouldn't come through and take off with them. People were so thrilled that Richmond was going to be the capital of the Confederacy, and they really had no idea what they were signing up for, because it just made Richmond a huge target. And then the city ended up in ashes by the end. And I mean, at that point, Richmond was the most industrialized city in the South, and then it's really never recovered. I mean, it's not any, it's Atlanta's a much bigger city. Charlotte, Richmond has never really totally recovered from the Civil War.
I think I find it a little bit difficult to summon the sympathy for the poor folks who couldn't keep their slaves in check. Well, here's the world's smallest island.
Yes, I hear you. It's just interesting of just we are all a product of our past. And people, Civil War is very taboo now. People don't even like to talk about it, but it's we're not going to learn from it if we don't talk about it. And there's a lot of nuances out there, but it's every place is a product of its history. So I mean, look at Atlanta. It's like so much of it was burned down. Everything there is new. There's really nothing old there. But ignoring the past doesn't make it go away. So we need to honor the people that suffered so much. And this cemetery that I was at the other day, it's in a rough part of town, and they built 95, Interstate 95, and it went right over an African burial ground. I mean, it's just awful, just absolutely horrible. Because this area of Richmond, it's called Jackson Ward. It used to be known as the Harlem of the South. And they put 95 right through the middle of it. So, I mean, the area is still there, but it's never going to be the same as what it was when they, put 95 going right through the middle of it. But it's just good for us all to learn from all this. And
That tempers the view of the modern world a little bit, I think, because if you've been running, if you're like me, esteemed audience, and you ran around a little bit during the pandemic, and certainly during the our new neighbor Mike Pence's time in the White House, if you were running around a little bit like, oh my God, everything is on fire, this is just madness. Well, a nice thing about going back and reading our history is like, no, it's frequently been on fire.
Yeah.
A lot of madness that continues. I don't know if that's comforting, but at least gives you some context for what's going on. Yeah.
Right. No, but I do find it really comforting to realize of these contentious times, and just, I mean, that we were, had a civil war going on for 5 years, and we got through that. So I do think it's comforting, and realizing that these, we like to think, oh, everything was all peaceful, and it's like not everyone was a patriot during the Revolutionary War. 1/3 of the people were loyalists, another third were undecided, and the other third were patriots. So we try to simplify history, but there's always going to be just a widespread diaspora of views, all over the spectrum. So War of 1812 with the Federalists and the Republicans, I mean, they couldn't have been more different in their views, and they had their reasons. I mean, the Federalists were for a strong federal government, like George Washington, like Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. And they wanted a standing army. They wanted a federal bank. And, turned out they were right. I mean, Madison, after the War of 1812, he was like, okay, I understand why these call-up militias are not good enough. And that's one of the great things about Madison, is I felt like he's teachable. He learned, and his views would evolve. And realizing you can't fight a war without a federal bank and a standing army, especially against the greatest military power in the world. So Jefferson just had a much more view of these agrarian farmers and all that. But but the Federalists, they were all in the shipping industry. So Jefferson had wanted to put in and Madison, as the Secretary of State, wanted to put in these embargoes on trade with Great Britain before the War of 1812. And the embargoes ended up really only destroying the economy in the Northeast, where the Federalists were. So the Federalists were justifiably angry, like, this embargo isn't even working, and it's hurting us, and it's not hurting you. So, I mean, I definitely feel for the Federalists, and thought they had every right to be as angry as they were. So that's kind of interesting too. It's when you stop looking at who your team is, if you're Team Jefferson or Team, Hamilton, and you actually look at what the actual issues are, and realizing, okay, well, maybe I actually, I probably would have been more of a Federalist at the time. But also, they just didn't know what we know then. They just, like my son's a huge history buff, and he was saying that in the Articles of Confederation that were so loosey-goosey, that he was just saying that people thought that the Articles of Confederation were asking for too much, because people really wanted all the power to remain with the states. So, and then, with the Constitution, it's, it amped it up so much that the Articles of Confederation were too loose, and that we needed the Constitution. So, that's the thing. I try to remind myself of, like I said, if our country started 20 years ago in 2002, when we were, Friends was our favorite show, like that we don't, we didn't have that experience to look back on, to learn from, that we do, that we can look back, with our kind of critical gaze, and have a different perspective that they just didn't have open to them, because they were living through the times, not looking back on them.
something that it was Dan Carlin. I'm sure he was repeating somebody else on his show, Hardcore History, which I never get tired of recommending other podcasts that people could be listening to instead of this one. But I'm a fan of Hardcore History, and something he said.
I'm gonna have to write that down.
I believe it was the ancient Greeks. He did an episode, and he was talking about, now you need to remember that for these people, magic was real, and it had never occurred to before. Oh yeah, nobody's Googling this. Nobody has the definitive information. Most of the people are illiterate. The people in power say magic is real. They keep hearing tales that magical acts were performed here. I'm sure, of course, there's some David Copperfield trickery going on that convinces them that magic's happening right there. But if they're saying that we're about to fight a witch, they're really thinking they're about to fight a witch, or they're fighting a wizard, or whoever the villain is, because magic's really. So thinking about our own history, nobody's got the internet, nobody has the future in mind of how this is all going to turn out, nor do we currently. It does put a nice perspective on there of how limited their perspectives might have been in some ways, and how little information they would have had, and how easy it is to take for granted how much information that we have now. So much so that people say, well, I don't need to know it. It'll be here in the cloud for me later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like back then, a cloud was just a cloud. But yeah, just even, being able to transmit information too, or receiving information, because the Battle of New Orleans happened on January 8th of 1815. And it took forever, it took about a month basically to get word up from there about the, miraculous victory there. And because there were no roads and all of that, but also there was there had been a blizzard that had struck Washington City. Washington City had an epidemic of, they call it it was called putrid sore throat. So that's January 8th. They get the word back, 3 weeks to a month later. They're celebrating in the streets, for weeks. Women out there with pots and pans. Dolley's got candles lit in every window of the Octagon House, and nonstop celebration. And then basically once the celebrations stop, all of a sudden, someone comes back from the delegation over in Bruges, Belgium, with a treaty. And the treaty had been signed on December 24th, 1814. So this was before the Battle of New Orleans. So technically, the Battle of New Orleans did not need to have been fought at all, because the war was ended. But because of the challenges of getting word, but also it was definitely in our best interest that we did have the Battle of New Orleans, because it's what really made people feel like we won the war, even though the terms of the treaty were very weak. It was, all it did was restore the status quo. It didn't even touch on impressment, which wasn't an issue anymore because Napoleon had been defeated. So the British didn't need to impress our sailors anymore, but it wasn't even mentioned in the agreement. But the perception of people was that we won the war after the Battle of New Orleans. But yeah, it's just pretty crazy when you think about the lack of communication. It's amazing, really. Anything got done.
What a terrible, if you're somebody who was wounded or lost people in the war and you find out later, oh, it didn't even need to happen. Oh, right. That's not a good day.